A book shouldn't make you a target, but on that sweltering afternoon, it nearly did. What happens when authority meets someone who taught that authority how to wear the badge? The answer would unfold on a crowded sidewalk, where assumptions would collide with reality, and where one woman's quiet dignity would become an unforgettable lesson. The air hung thick and humid over Riverside Boulevard that Tuesday afternoon, the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer and tempers flare. Kendra Williams emerged from the corner bookshop with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her athletic build evident beneath her simple navy tank top and jeans. She'd spent the last hour browsing, selecting a novel that had been recommended by a friend, the kind of therapeutic escape she rarely allowed herself these days. The squeal of brakes shattered her peaceful thoughts. A patrol car jerked to a stop at the curb, so close she instinctively stepped back. The door swung open before the vehicle had fully settled. "Hold it right there," came the sharp command. Kendra turned, her expression carefully neutral despite the spike of adrenaline. Officer Derek Mason approached with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd already decided how this encounter would end. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, but something in his eyes contradicted the professionalism his appearance promised. "Can I help you, officer?" Kendra kept her voice even, controlled. "That bag." He gestured with his chin, his hand resting on his belt. "You got a receipt for what's in there?" The question landed like an accusation. Around them, the flow of pedestrian traffic began to slow. Heads turned. Phones emerged from pockets with practiced ease, the modern reflex to document rather than intervene. "I just purchased a book," Kendra replied, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Is there a problem?" Derek's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yeah, there's a problem. We've had reports of shoplifting in this area, women matching your description." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Kendra felt the familiar weight of it, the unspoken details that comprised your description. She'd faced this before, in different forms, throughout her life, but knowing it was coming never dulled the sting. "I'd like to see the receipt," Derek continued, stepping closer into her personal space. "It's in my bag," Kendra said quietly, reaching for the zipper. Slowly, his hand moved toward his holster, a theatrical gesture that made several onlookers gasp. Her fingers stilled. The crowd had grown larger now, a semicircle of witnesses forming on the sidewalk. She could hear their murmurs, feel their stares, some sympathetic, some curious, some already filming. "Officer, I'm going to reach into my bag for my receipt," Kendra announced clearly, each word deliberate. "I'm moving slowly. I'm complying with your request." She unzipped the canvas bag with careful movements, aware that every gesture was being scrutinized, recorded, potentially misinterpreted. Inside lay the paperback novel she'd just bought, its cover bright and new, her wallet, a water bottle, chapstick, the mundane contents of an ordinary afternoon. Derek snatched the bag from her hands before she could retrieve the receipt. The sudden aggression made her stumble back a step. "Hey!" a voice called from the crowd, but no one moved forward. He dumped the contents onto the hood of his cruiser with theatrical force. The book skidded across the hot metal and tumbled to the concrete sidewalk. Pages bent, the spine cracked audibly in the summer silence. Kendra's breath caught. That book, specifically that title, held significance beyond its story. Her father had read it to her when she was young, his voice painting pictures in the darkness of their small apartment. He'd passed 3 years ago, and she'd finally felt ready to revisit those memories. Now the cover lay torn against the dirty pavement. She bent to retrieve it, her movements slow and measured, despite the fury building in her chest. "I said don't move," Derek barked, his hand returning to his belt. "I'm picking up my property that you damaged," Kendra responded, her voice tight but controlled. She'd learned long ago that showing anger in these situations only escalated them. But compliance felt like surrender, and she'd surrendered enough. A small girl in a pink dress pressed against her mother's leg nearby, her eyes wide. "Mama, why is he being mean to that lady?" The child's voice carried in the tense quiet. "Shh, baby," the mother whispered, pulling her daughter closer. Derek rifled through Kendra's wallet, pulling out her credit cards, her driver's license. He studied each item as if searching for evidence of a crime that existed only in his imagination. "Everything seems to be in order," a woman's voice called out sarcastically from the crowd. "Maybe you should apologize and let her go." Derek's neck flushed red. "This is police business. Everyone stay back." "This is harassment," another voice countered. "We're all witnessing it." The officer's movements became more agitated. He was playing to an audience now, and the audience wasn't appreciating the performance. He needed to justify his actions, to prove the stop was warranted. His hands moved to the smaller pockets of her bag, searching for something, anything. "Officer, you need to state your probable cause," Kendra said, her legal training surfacing. "You haven't articulated any reasonable suspicion beyond a vague description." "Don't tell me how to do my job, lady." Derek's voice rose an octave. "You people always think you know better." The phrase detonated in the space between them. "You people." Two words that carried centuries of weight, of assumptions, of systemic dismissal. The crowd's murmur intensified. "Excuse me?" Kendra straightened to her full height, her athletic frame suddenly seeming more imposing. "You people?" Derek realized his mistake too late. His eyes darted to the surrounding phones, the recording witnesses. "That's not... I didn't mean..." "What did you mean?" Kendra pressed, her voice gaining strength. "Please, enlighten us all." "What exactly did you mean by that?" He fumbled for words, his earlier confidence crumbling. There's a protocol and you're not cooperating." "I've complied with every request," Kendra countered. "I've been respectful. I've remained calm, despite you destroying my property and violating my rights in front of these witnesses." Derek's jaw clenched. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. In his experience, civilians backed down when confronted with authority. They apologized even when innocent. They made themselves small. This woman was doing none of those things. "Turn around," he commanded suddenly. "Hands behind your back." The crowd erupted in protest. "For what? She didn't do anything. This is wrong." Kendra's heart hammered, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. "On what grounds are you detaining me?" "You're being arrested for obstruction and suspicious behavior." "Suspicious behavior," Kendra repeated slowly, letting the absurdity hang in the air. "Reading while black, you mean?" "Don't make this about race," Derek snapped, reaching for his handcuffs. "You made this about race the moment you stopped me without cause," Kendra replied, her voice carrying across the street. "You saw a black woman with a bag and assumed criminality. That's called racial profiling, officer." His hand clamped around her wrist, tighter than necessary. She winced but didn't pull away. Resistance would only give him justification for escalation. "This is assault," someone yelled. "We're all recording this." Derek hesitated, suddenly aware of how many cameras were pointed at him. His grip loosened slightly, but he didn't release her. "Check her ID," a man's voice suggested from the crowd. "At least do that before you arrest her." Sweat beaded on Derek's forehead. He'd backed himself into a corner, and the crowd sensed it. With his free hand, he reached into the pile of Kendra's belongings on the cruiser hood, searching through the spilled contents of her wallet. His fingers caught on something hard and rectangular in a side pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another credit card. Instead, he found himself staring at a military identification card, the kind with embedded security features and official seals. The color in his face changed. His mouth went dry. Kendra watched him read it, saw the exact moment recognition dawned. She remained silent, letting the discovery speak for itself. "United States Navy," Derek read aloud, his voice faltering. Special Warfare Development Group, Training Command. The crowd pressed closer. She's military. Special Warfare, that's SEAL training. Oh, this guy's in trouble now. Derek's eyes scanned further down the card. Under Kendra's name and rank was her position. Senior Instructor, SEAL Qualification Course. His hands began to shake visibly. That's my identification, Kendra said quietly. Her tone shifted from defensive to authoritative. I believe you're familiar with it. He looked up at her and she saw the moment his memory caught up with the present. His eyes widened. You, he breathed. Yes, Kendra confirmed. Me, Instructor Williams. From the tactical training seminar you attended 2 years ago. The one where you failed the ethics and judgment scenarios twice. The crowd fell into stunned silence. This revelation reframed everything they'd witnessed. This wasn't just a citizen being harassed. This was a military instructor who'd trained law enforcement, being profiled by someone she'd once attempted to teach. Derek's hand fell away from her wrist. I didn't recognize... You didn't recognize me because you never really saw me, Kendra interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse. Not then, not now. You saw a woman. You saw my skin color. You saw your own assumptions. But you never saw the person. She took a step forward, reclaiming her space. Derek instinctively stepped back. In my training sessions, I teach officers about implicit bias, Kendra continued, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority. I teach them about constitutional rights, about de-escalation, about treating every citizen with dignity regardless of their appearance. Do you remember any of that, Officer Mason? His name, spoken aloud, made him flinch. She'd remembered him. Despite teaching hundreds of officers over the years, she'd remembered his name, his failures, his inability to separate his prejudices from his duty. I was following procedure, Derek stammered weakly. Procedure, Kendra repeated, the word heavy with disappointment. Your procedure was to stop a woman leaving a bookstore without probable cause, to publicly humiliate her, to damage her property, to use physical force during a minor investigatory stop. Tell me, which part of the procedure manual covers that? He had no answer. His earlier swagger had evaporated completely, replaced by the posture of a student being called out for failing a basic test. You had power in this situation, Kendra said, her voice dropping lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear. A badge, a gun, the presumption of authority. And how did you use that power? To target, to intimidate, to demean. She bent down and picked up her damaged book, cradling it against her chest. This was my father's favorite novel. He was a janitor who never got past 8th grade, but he believed in the power of stories, of education, of bettering yourself. He taught me that knowledge wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon against ignorance. Her eyes locked onto Derek's. And ignorance, officer, is the most dangerous thing a person in uniform can carry. The phrase resonated through the crowd like a bell. Phones captured every word. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a teaching moment, broadcast in real time to countless viewers. You failed my course because you couldn't separate your personal biases from your professional responsibilities, Kendra continued relentlessly. I wrote in your evaluation that you needed serious remedial training before being allowed to interact with diverse communities. I recommended additional oversight. Tell me, did your department follow through on those recommendations? Derek's silence was answer enough. I thought not. Kendra began collecting her scattered belongings, placing them carefully back into her bag. You know what the irony is? I spend my days training elite operators, teaching them to see beyond surface judgments, to assess threats based on behavior and evidence, not prejudice. And yet here I am, being judged by someone who couldn't even pass my basic course. She zipped her bag closed and slung it over her shoulder. The crowd remained transfixed, watching the complete reversal of power dynamics. I could file a formal complaint, Kendra said thoughtfully. I could contact your commanding officer, your department's internal affairs. I have witnesses, recordings, documented evidence of racial profiling and excessive force. Derek's face went pale. His career hung in the balance, and everyone watching knew it. But I won't, Kendra continued, and a ripple of surprise moved through the onlookers. Not today. Instead, I'm going to give you something more valuable than a reprimand. She stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear her next words clearly, though the nearby phones might catch them. I'm giving you a choice, Officer Mason. You can learn from this moment, or you can repeat it. You can acknowledge your biases and work to overcome them, or you can continue being the kind of officer who makes communities less safe. The kind who erodes trust, the kind who proves every negative stereotype about law enforcement. She pulled out her own phone, pulling up her camera app. I'm documenting this encounter too, every detail. I'm noting the time, the location, your badge number, and the nature of this stop. This record will exist, filed with my professional observations. Derek found his voice barely a whisper. What are you going to do with it? That depends entirely on you, Kendra replied. If I hear about another incident like this with your name attached, if you fail to learn this lesson, then this documentation becomes part of a pattern, evidence of repeated misconduct. But if you actually take this to heart, if you become the officer you took an oath to be, then maybe this stays between us as a reminder of who you don't want to be. She held his gaze for a long moment, letting the weight of accountability settle on his shoulders. The choice is yours, she finished, but understand this. I'm watching, and I'm not the only one. She gestured to the crowd, to the dozens of phones still recording, to the witnesses who would remember this day. Kendra turned to leave, her shoulders squared, her head high. As she walked past the assembled crowd, several people began to clap. Slowly at first, then building into genuine applause. Someone called out, "Thank you for your service." Another voice added, "You handled that with such grace." A young woman with her phone still raised stopped Kendra gently. "Ma'am, what you said about knowledge being a weapon against ignorance, that was powerful. Can I share this video?" Kendra paused, considering. "Yes," she said finally. "But if you do, include this message. This isn't about one bad officer. This is about systems that allow this behavior to continue. This is about the need for real accountability, real training, real change. Make sure people understand that." The woman nodded seriously. "I will. I promise." As Kendra continued down the sidewalk, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Behind her, Derek stood frozen beside his cruiser, surrounded by scattered contents of her bag that he hadn't finished gathering. His radio crackled with a call he didn't answer. A little boy tugged on his father's hand as Kendra passed. "Dad, is she a superhero?" The father smiled softly, watching her retreating form. "Not the kind that wears a cape, son. But yeah, I'd say she is." Kendra heard the exchange and felt something loosen in her chest. This confrontation could have ended so differently. She knew the statistics, knew how many similar encounters escalated into tragedy. Her military training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but no amount of training could fully prepare someone for the indignity of being profiled, targeted, questioned for simply existing. She thought about her father, about the countless times he must have faced similar treatment without the credentials to defend himself. How many indignities had he swallowed in silence? How many times had he been stopped, questioned, made to feel less than human, all because someone in authority couldn't see past the color of his skin? The damaged book in her bag felt heavier now, weighted with memory and meaning. She'd get a new copy, but this torn one would stay with her as a reminder. evidence that the struggle wasn't over, that vigilance was necessary, that silence equaled complicity. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages. Word had already spread through her military network. Colleagues checking in, offering support, expressing outrage on her behalf. She'd respond later. Right now, she just wanted to get home, to process what had happened in private. But as she turned the corner onto a quieter street, Kendra allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She'd stood her ground. She'd refused to be diminished. And maybe, just maybe, she'd taught one officer a lesson he'd actually remember. The question was whether he'd choose to learn from it. Back on Riverside Boulevard, the crowd slowly dispersed. Derek remained beside his cruiser, staring at the empty sidewalk where Kendra had stood. His hands still trembled. His mind replayed the encounter, seeing it now through different eyes, through the lens of the cameras, through the perspective of the woman he'd wronged. He remembered her from the training course now, though he'd never have admitted it aloud. She'd been demanding, exacting, refusing to accept mediocrity from any of the officers in her program. He'd resented her authority then, had complained to his peers that she was too rigid, too critical. He'd failed her scenarios because he'd relied on assumptions rather than evidence, on stereotypes rather than observation. He hadn't learned the lesson then, but standing there, surrounded by witnesses to his misconduct, he wondered if he'd finally learned it now. The afternoon heat pressed down as Derek finally began gathering the scattered items from the cruiser hood. His radio crackled again, dispatch calling his unit number. He'd have to answer eventually, would have to explain why he'd been out of service for so long, would have to decide whether to file a report on the encounter, and if so, what version of events to document. The truth would make him look terrible, but the videos were already online. The truth was no longer his to control. As Kendra Williams walked home through the city streets, the weight of the afternoon gradually lifted from her shoulders. She'd faced down authority and won, not through aggression but through dignity, not through violence but through truth. Her father would have been proud. She carried that pride with her, along with the torn book that somehow meant more now than it had before. Tomorrow she'd return to her work training the next generation of warriors. She'd continue teaching them about judgment, about bias, about the responsibility that came with power. And she'd add today's story to her curriculum, an example of why the lessons mattered, why the training was essential, why complacency in the face of injustice made everyone less safe. But tonight, she'd mourn the dignity she'd had to fight to keep, the normalcy that had been stolen by someone else's prejudice, the simple afternoon that had turned into another battle in a war she was tired of fighting. Progress was slow, painful, measured in moments like these, but it was progress nonetheless. And Kendra Williams would keep pushing forward, one confrontation, one lesson, one moment of truth at a time.